Introduce our speaker, so we're going to share some of the information regarding our speaker. Kirsten Beyer is a professor of epidemiology and social sciences at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Trained as a health geographer, she focuses on the intersection of health, place, and social and environmental justice. She seeks to identify environmental and systematic causes of health disparities and to apply a community-engaged research framework to move research findings into program and policy solutions to achieve health equity. She studies neighborhood characteristics such as green spaces, racial segregation and redlining, as well as innovative community-driven solutions to address challenges such as climate change and structural racism. She works locally and globally with a focus on non-communicable diseases, including cancer and mental health. She's director of the PhD program in Public and Community Health. She's co-director of the Global Health Pathways for Medical Students and co-director of the Geospatial Epidemiology
You had to say that word
Epidemiology and Outcomes Shared Resource of the MCW Cancer Center. She holds an adjunct faculty appointment in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, so welcome.
Thank you. So do I just click on the keyboard? Is that the best way to do it?
Do you want to click here?
I don't need one. I'm fine. I can come back. I'll just probably wander around a little bit. Can you guys hear me? I'll try to just wave if you're missing things, and I'll try to speak up. Oh, does it work?
I don't know.
It's all right. I'll just do it.
Yeah,
It does?
I would use the keyboard.
Use the keyboard.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the safe route.
Well, thank you. It's really nice to meet all of you. I've met a couple of you in meetings today, so I'm just really grateful to be here. I've collaborated with folks in UW-Madison for a number of years, but less so some of the folks in the room, so I'm excited to build new collaborations and make linkages also with my Milwaukee communities and community partners. So thank you for the invite, especially to Dr. Notaro, who invited me to come and join you today. Also very excited to see Dr. Patz. We have some collaborative work ongoing, and I think Wenwen and I are going to be best friends. So lots of great things going on. So thank you. I'm going to present today just on an ongoing study that we have called Leveraging a Public School District and Schoolyard Spaces to Confront Climate Health Inequities in a Low-Income Urban Community of Color. And that community is Milwaukee, our neighbor here to Madison. This is a community engaged research project, and so I have some key partners I just want to acknowledge before we get started. Milwaukee Public Schools is the school district that we're working with, and they are working with Reflow, which is a nonprofit organization. It's really water focused, headed by an environmental engineer. And the goal of that partnership is to green Milwaukee schoolyards that are presently, many of them, at least sheets of asphalt. And so the main motivation for that is water control because of combined sewer overflow problems in the city of Milwaukee. So MMSD, if you know what that is, Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, is a big funder of some of those conversions. So it's water motivated at its outset, but there's so much else that can happen. And so they're using these spaces now to build curricular connections for the students. And if you don't know this, Milwaukee Public schoolyards are also community spaces, so they are open to neighbors as well. So they're really kind of like little pocket parks when it comes down to it, also for the neighborhood. So that's sort of the community-generated work that we are building our work around, trying to enhance what they're doing and provide some evidence around some of those endeavors. So the rationale for this study, I'm going to assume some knowledge from this group, so I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly. I think we all know that global climate change is a problem, and that it has a lot of potential impacts for human health. Some of the ones that this project is most associated with would be heat exposure, poor air quality, water quality and quantity in terms of that combined sewer overflow issue, and then just stressors, generally speaking. Importantly, the negative health impacts of climate change are not going to be borne equally. This is probably the biggest environmental justice issue that we have in our world today. If you think about it even from the global north to the global south, who's creating the emissions and who's suffering the consequences, that is a massive inequity. On a local scale, if you're thinking about Milwaukee as a community, we have disinvested neighborhoods, highly segregated communities that are going to bear the brunt of those climate health impacts, while those low-income populations are not the ones contributing the most to the problem. We also focus on children in this particular work. And children are susceptible for a number of reasons to climate change impacts. Some biological or physiological reasons, greater surface area of their bodies compared to their core, etc. But also they have very little agency or autonomy to do anything about it, right? And so we're actually seeing a lot of this climate anxiety of kids very worried about climate change but powerless to do anything about it. So there's a lot of reasons why we're focusing in on children. Green space. So this is a schoolyard greening project that we're interested in. And green space is one of those major ways that we can combat climate change. And we think about the idea of co-benefits of climate mitigation and adaptation, right? We put in the trees to sequester carbon, or we put in the trees to create shade. Well, they're also going to make people feel happier, right? They're also going to make people more likely to exercise. They're also going to improve air quality. So there are some climate mitigation and adaptation aspects to this, but also just generally, it's a good idea to have trees because of all the other benefits that they can provide. And then climate health equity is complex. Many problems are complex. I would say this is a very complex one, in particular because of that inequity that's centered in the problem. And so I believe that community engagement is the only way to do this kind of work, that we need to have the community voices and power at the table. And so that's the way that we framed this research project. So essentially, without intervention on a local scale, the failing school infrastructure, these asphalt schoolyards that were put in 70 years ago that are falling apart, will be limited, right, in what they're allowing the kids to do, and can cause injuries and various other problems, in addition to urban heat effects and flooding and various other consequences. So the alternative is for us to invest in resilience and to do something about the problem. So that's the major rationale for this. I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the past work that we've done in Wisconsin, particularly on green space, and also this is just a way of me highlighting the survey that helped Wisconsin and some collaborations here with Madison. We did a study a number of years ago looking at green space in terms of the normalized difference vegetation index and also percent tree canopy, and then looking at, using the SHOW database, at outcomes of health and wellness. And so one of the things that we found was that there was a really strong connection between green space exposure and mental health. So we looked at depression, anxiety, and stress, and looked at 25% more tree canopy and then 25% higher NDVI. Here, just illustrating those clear connections across all three of those outcomes. And this paper is published in a journal that is publicly available, so you're probably able to access it. We also worked with the EPA and Beyer Atlas group, as well as SHOW, to do another study where we looked at green space measured in different ways, and then active transportation. So if we did what many people do, which is just to take a circular buffer around a particular person's home, we didn't see anything significant. But when we took a more nuanced way of measuring green space, so green space along the streets or green space along the sidewalks, that's when the real associations came out. So I think this also shows, some of the measurement and approaches to the ways that we measure exposure are really, really, really important. And buffer sizes too, right? How close does it need to be meaningful? And in this case, it can be green space in all sorts of buffers that are leading to active transportation. I've also done some work with a PhD student of mine, Jean-Pierre Gomez. He just graduated. We're very proud of him. He's now a postdoc fellow at MCW. But we did a systematic review of the literature looking at the impact of schoolyard greening on different health outcomes. And so physical activity was one of the ones that we really focused on here. So these are the studies that he included in his review, and then the physical activity outcome measures. that were looked at, so time spent in moderate vigorous physical activity, time spent in light physical activity, etc., and then what the studies found. So there's some modifications there, some differences in what the studies found. Overall beneficial change was the primary group, but some mixed findings there in the impact of schoolyard greening on physical activity. We also looked at social emotional health. So some more clear benefits, I think, here that we found. These were the included studies, again, that looked at it, the different measures, so positive social behaviors or interactions, measures of well-being, measures of attention restoration, if you're familiar with attention restoration theory, the idea of being in nature, sort of allowing your mind to relax and improving your cognitive function, your executive function in particular. Appreciation of the green yard, and then verbal and physical conflict. And then we're finding a lot of beneficial changes there in the literature in terms of schoolyard greening promoting better health. Another piece that I'd just like to bring to the fore is that intersection between structural racism and green space. This is a study that was done by a postdoctoral fellow of mine, Seema Amin, and we took the old historical redlining maps. Or is this a familiar thing, yes or no? Familiar? Most people. Okay, so these were drawn in the 1930s. I won't go into the long description about them, but essentially the red areas were deemed hazardous, yellow were declining, and then green and blue were good areas, according to these assessors, to lend mortgages. So what we see ultimately is that, 80 years later, the amount of tree canopy in these areas is very well correlated and a nice gradient there with how they were rated back in the 1930s. So places that were deemed, don't invest in this place, have a lot less tree canopy today, which of course has outcomes for people as well. So this paper also looked at air pollution as an outcome, and the gradient is basically the same. Nobody's surprised, right? So back to this project. Milwaukee. I think probably a lot of you are familiar with Milwaukee, but I'm going to just talk through it a little bit to make sure everybody's on the same page. It's the largest city in Wisconsin with about 600,000 people, 10% of the state's population, one of the most segregated U.S. cities with large racial disparities. And if you go anywhere, they will say they are one of the most segregated cities. I don't know why everybody wants to be the most segregated city, but it does happen. Unfortunately, Milwaukee actually is. If you run the statistics for measures of segregation, we come out 1, 2, or 3 almost every time. So it's really terribly segregated. And you can see a map of the distributions there on the right-hand side. Wisconsin, of course, is expected to face a number of climate change-related challenges. In Milwaukee, major things that we're worried about are flooding, like I mentioned before, urban heat, and then air pollution. Changes in some of those patterns. Milwaukee Public Schools, again a major partner in this work, is the largest Wisconsin school district and 43rd largest in the U.S., 72,000 students, 158 schools. So pretty big district. It's also a very racially diverse district. So 51% of the students are Black or African American, 27% Hispanic, 10% white, 7.6% Asian, and then other percentages are quite a bit lower. 82% or 83% of MPS students are economically disadvantaged. So that's a shocking number for a public school district. My kids actually went to MPS schools. They went to the German immersion school. My husband's German. We were trying to teach them German. And while our kids were students there, the district decided, you know what, it's too much work to figure out who needs free and reduced lunch because everybody needs free and reduced lunch, so we're just going to give everybody free food. So they chose free food over administration, mainly because of this huge percentage of people who were going to need it. We also have a large percentage of kids with disabilities of various kinds, and then many students who have been on Medicaid. So very, very disadvantaged school district. A lot of kids needing support. So there has been some responses to these problems in Milwaukee. I don't know if you guys knew this, but the city of Milwaukee was the first in the nation to declare racism as a public health crisis in 2019. And then New York and some other places thought that was a cool idea and they followed suit. But yeah, Milwaukee was the first one. We have an environmental collaboration office in the city of Milwaukee that has a climate and health equity plan, including a focus on nature in the city, under which some of this schoolyard greening stuff falls. And then the Milwaukee Public School District in itself has been making moves towards sustainability in recent years. So they passed a few resolutions that sort of summarize this. The first one in 2017 is called Our House is on Fire. It was a climate justice resolution, and it essentially mandates teaching climate justice in MPS schools. Well, I can tell you for a fact, that was 2017, now we're in 2024. It's still not happening, and the reason for that is that it was an unfunded mandate, so to speak. We declare it will happen, and then yet we don't have the resources to make it happen and whatnot. So our project is partially trying to contribute to making that happen. The second resolution, uniting with the city and county to meet IPCC climate justice targets. It's really just about meeting those targets. So they're saying, the board is saying, yes, we want to work on that, we want to contribute to that. And the third is one focused on the Green Revolving Fund. So the idea here is to try to capture sustainability savings and reinvest those in sustainability. So for example, when they green a schoolyard, the stormwater runoff decreases, and so the stormwater bill essentially that they have to pay to the city goes away, right? So they save a lot of money there. And then the idea is, okay, let's not just take that and throw it into the big pot, let's take that and reinvest that in sustainability efforts so we can find more places to save money and more places to improve sustainability. At the moment, MPS has dedicated funding and positions for 2 sustainability project specialists. These folks live in the facilities department of the school district. And then 1 climate justice instructional coach. And we're working with her and partially funding her position at this point. So their goals are to facilitate sustainability projects across the districts, including the schoolyard redevelopments, which is more on the facilities side, and then the curriculum advancements, which is more on the climate justice coaches side. And then, like I mentioned before, motivated by climate resilience and stormwater control in particular, MPS has partnered with Reflow to green these schoolyards and try to reap the benefits of that. So within that context, we proposed this project. This is an EPA-funded project. I think you said you have a project funded by the same sort of program announcement that came out a couple of years later. So great to know that EPA is really investing in this type of work. Our first aim is really focused on the curriculum side of things. So we're trying to engage with the students, staff, and families to develop this curriculum. Essentially what we're wanting to do primarily is to train the teachers how to teach climate. Because we have this mandate, they're supposed to be doing it, but they have no idea how to do it, they're not organized to do it, they don't have the resources to do it. And so we're trying to make that easier by training the teachers in order to implement that. Later in the project, we're also going to have some dialogue sessions. We haven't gotten to that yet. And then aim 2 is what we call GROW, the Green Recreation Outdoors for Wellness Study. And essentially the goal of this is to do a lot of measurements before and after greening and see what the impacts of these green infrastructure investments are on those kids. So I'm just going to go through each aim and just provide an update of where we are. This is aim 1, the curriculum and dialogue. We have developed a curriculum for these MPS teachers to teach them how to teach climate. Our first cohort had 25 people enrolled, and we completed pre and post surveys. We're gearing up for the fall curriculum, and that is full so far. There are 38 people signed up. We've changed it from being a 10-module curriculum to being an 8-module curriculum based on some feedback from the participants. So the 10-module curriculum is now, it's a smaller number of sessions, but they're longer, and they're structured a little bit differently.
What's the grade level?
It's for everybody. Yeah. And then, of course, the dialogue sessions later. So our first cohort, I'll tell you more about this group and then about the curriculum. This is Kim. She's our climate justice instructional coach. Michael knows her, I think. This is our first group. So age about 45 is a mean. More women than men, but relatively interested on both sides there. Race, 76% white, 20% Black or African American, and 4% biracial. Ethnicity, primarily non-Hispanic. Highest level of education, mostly graduate or professional. Again, these are MPS teachers. And then years of experience in their current role, 10 years. Years of experience at MPS, about 13. And years of experience in education, about 18. So a pretty experienced group overall, although there's a range of experience in there. And then to your question, like what grade level and what subject, we have all sorts of people. So this is the sort of the areas that they represent. Math, library media, language arts, social studies, science, et cetera, et cetera. Grade levels K through 12, including AP. So the beauty of this is that we're trying to provide curriculum that will inform the teachers on how to teach climate, and then there's some bespoke curriculum development stuff that is more targeted to each of their areas and each of their grade levels. I know you can't read this, but I'd be happy to share this information later, just to give you a high-level understanding of what the curriculum includes. The first module is an introduction to the course, and then talking about just generally trying to understand what pieces they're interested in too. Like, are there any major themes coming out from these teachers about things that they really want to know? Can we target or adapt the curriculum to serve their needs specifically? Module 2 focuses in on global climate change, sort of a 101 type of section, talking about the carbon cycle, greenhouse effect, human activity, and also be going into the misinformation around climate science. Module 3 is focused in on environmental health and justice, so really trying to bring in those ideas of who has and who hasn't, who contributes and who doesn't, who suffers the consequences and who doesn't, to give them a sense of the differences that in the ways that climate is going to impact health. Module 4 is impacts of global climate change. There's a big focus here on health because that's the focus of the grant, but we do look at other social and economic impacts as well. Module 5, we already head on towards solutions because by this point you're starting to depress people and they want to know, what can I do to take action? And so we start talking about solutions and all the way from like individual, like how do I reduce my footprint solutions to, okay, what can we do to help the world solutions. Module 6 goes more deeply into environmental justice and focuses on climate justice specifically. And then Module 7, 8, 9, and 10 are really where the operationalizing of this comes into play, and they start to specialize and they start to figure out, okay, how do I actually practically implement this in my teaching? So Module 7 is where we talk about resources. There are so many resources now that people can take advantage of. There's a new portal that Kim Tellerico was part of developing that has a lot of climate lesson plans, for example, and links to books and webinars and things like that. But we are also talking about things like, are there any gadgets that you need to bring into your classroom to operationalize these, like to have kids playing with IR thermometers and figuring out what does this actually mean in real world. Module 8, we talk about integrating. So you can see that they're all doing different types of things. Integrating climate science into math or into education looks different. So there's some brainstorming aspects to that, but also like exploring some of the lesson plans that really target those particular areas. And then they actually create their own lesson plan as part of the sessions, and then they implement the lesson plan. And so each of them gets to work with Kim to implement their plan. If they're shy about it, she will implement it for them, and they can learn from watching her implement it. Or they may go ahead and do it themselves, and she might help. And then they come back together for Module 10, where they celebrate the successes, share what they've learned. And so as part of what we're doing, we're collecting all of the things that they put together so that we can use those in the future and understand sort of what some of the impacts might be. So in order to evaluate this, we looked at a few different things. The first thing we looked at was climate change hope. As you can imagine, there's a lot of anxiety about climate change and a lot of feeling that it's so big and what can I do about it? I'm only one person. And so we looked at climate change hope to understand, how are they feeling more empowered or more disempowered, by having some of this information. And so this scale was built in 2017, and it goes to willpower and way power, and trying to understand, to what extent do individuals believe they're able to meet goals they set for themselves, and to what extent can they think of ways to overcome challenges. So we have 3 factors in this scale. And we really like this scale. I don't know if other people have ever seen it or used it. And so this is Victoria Toledo. She's a medical student. She did our analysis for us. And what we found were significant pre-post changes, so they were feeling more hopeful after receiving information. So that's a good sign, right? We didn't give people a lot of information about climate change and make them feel less hopeful about solving it, which is a real risk, really. If you tell people more about a problem, then they're more likely to think about that problem and could start ruminating. But in this case, they felt more hopeful, which is great. And again, this is just 22 people who did the pre and post surveys, so it's a very small sample size. We're hoping to increase that by offering this 2 more times. We also used a tool that we built ourselves. We haven't published this tool yet, but it's an environmental health literacy scale that we built for teachers, for adults, teachers, particularly at MPS schools. We also built a companion tool for kids to make sure that the reading level was lower and the questions are fewer and all of that. And these are just some example questions on the right-hand side. But the scale focuses first on literacy and then on self-efficacy, sort of the idea of, can I do something about this? We have some overlapping domains: air, indoor, water, food, heat, sun, and then some that are sort of across. There's some questions that address climate change, some that are more focused on ecosystem services, and some more focused on environmental justice. And so pre and post, we saw, first of all, I think it's important to say, we saw really high levels of literacy among this group. And I would say, if I had to say there's a bias in this group, it would probably be math and science folks. This next time, we're focusing more on language arts, social studies, right? Trying to get a diversity of people engaged here. But despite the fact that they had really high levels of literacy at the beginning, we did see some increases that were significant here as well. So this is the overall literacy scale, this is the overall self-efficacy, and then we saw big changes for air, indoor spaces and water, heat and sun, and climate. Not significant for food, ecosystem services, or environmental justice. The last one is the one that makes me a little bit concerned, because I would love to see there be higher levels of understanding of environmental justice, and also bigger change in that, because that's really a focus area for the curriculum. So that's one place where we're trying to focus our efforts on improving the curriculum to address that. We also did a little knowledge test. This is from a manuscript, but the original manuscript used 10 questions for each. We didn't have the time to do that. We needed to shorten it, so we ended up using 5 questions. And although we saw changes, none of them were significant. This is the percent, essentially. Everybody was really high on the knowledge tests. So I'm expecting it will be lower if we go into non-science disciplines more often. And then the last one, which I think is really interesting, we really wanted to look at this idea of equity, racial discrimination, environmental justice. And so we did something called the Colorblind Racial Attitudes Scale. And so this is essentially trying to measure the degree to which you believe that there's a just world, there isn't inequity, and that having racial and gender intolerance and racial prejudice. So sort of that underlying racial discrimination. So there are 3 factors here: unawareness of racial privilege, unawareness of institutional discrimination, and unawareness of blatant racial issues. And in this one, we also saw improvements. So our participants decreased their levels of unawareness of racial privilege, decreased their levels of unawareness of institutional discrimination, And then already the unawareness of blatant racial issues was pretty low. So that would be the very, very obvious, racial discrimination issues. People didn't change much there and already had no unawareness, basically. So overall, we're feeling pretty good about this because this is only 22 people and we're already seeing a statistically significant change. And we're hopeful that as we increase the number of people, we're going to see some diversity and be able to look at the subgroups as well. A few other things that we did with this, we're collecting attendance and looking at sort of the dose effect of how many sessions they attend, as well as are they attending, how are they rating the sessions. We have a little bit of qualitative feedback. We're collecting the materials that they put together in their lesson plans. And then we're also taking teacher recommendations for classroom resources. So Kim is building a library of resources at the district in order to help support the students. And this is a picture of some of her 100 books that have gone into all of these schools across the district. But things like IR thermometers, they really wanted to use tools and to get more engaged in the science aspects of that. So they need Michael Notaro to go in with the Terra rover and teach them how to measure all sorts of things. So I'm going to pause just for a minute and see if there are any questions on that first aim, and then I'll go ahead and go to the second one. Yeah.
You said for the next session of the class that you were going to remove 2 of the modules, right?
Not remove them, but restructure
Oh, okay.
a little bit.
I was wondering which what kind of changes?
Yeah, so if let me show you. That's a good question. Yeah, it makes me a little nervous to do this, but I think we need to make the curriculum as good as, that's the #1 goal. But it's really these down here. What we found is that they wanted to have those resources and that actionability happening all the time rather than at the end. And they were willing to take on extra time, in order to make the sessions longer to have that happen. So essentially we're going to be taking things like resources and integration of this into their lesson plans and then talking about it in the context of global climate change and environmental justice, all of those pieces. So really making each of the lessons more operationalizable in the classroom. Question? Yeah.
Maybe an end of saying, but how about the fine arts community involved? Because there's so many strong fine arts at UW, even in the architectural or design community, which actually aligns with some of these goals, in my understanding. I don't really know a lot.
Yeah.
But, just changing your space in your urban community and really teaching the next generation of architectural students to pay attention to community.
Yeah. Architecture and fine arts is what you're talking about.
Is it architecture and fine arts now? Yeah, I thought it was the school of architectural and urban planning.
Oh, yeah, so this is for elementary school kids, but yeah, I mean, we have actually guest lecturers who come in, and, integrating some of those specialties and some of those expertise areas, yeah, we have tried to do that.
This is grade school, not?
This is grade school,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Well, so the curriculum is for grade school teachers, right? These are the teachers, the MPS teachers, who are going to teach climate justice to the elementary students. So we're trying to give them a baseline level of knowledge about how to do that, because they're just being asked to do it, and they don't have a way of operationalizing that. But yeah.
Because of the initiative, the unfunded mandate.
Yeah, the unfunded mandate, and then no way to get there. So I think their way power would have been very low. But we're trying to fix that problem. Any other questions on this piece? They're kind of separate, so I just thought maybe we can do one at a time. You just want to talk about this, right? So this is aim 2, and this is what really brought us into the project to begin with. This idea of the fact that a lot of MPS schools, remember there are 158, maybe 159 schools, a lot of them are sheets of asphalt. And that was a decision that was made many, many years ago. The goal was to make maintenance zero. It's always been a low-income school district, right? And so making maintenance zero is a really good way of saving money. But of course, if you look at that, it's very depressing. There's not much you can do on it. Some of them have like markings for Foursquare or whatever, but it's pretty sad. It's also dangerous. So if you fall on cement or asphalt, it hurts, right? Falling on grass is a much better situation. And it's also bad in terms of water. Not just the fact that it's not allowing stormwater to come into the ground, right? That it's sheathing that water into the stormwater drains. But also because if the water falls on that, and we are in Wisconsin, it freezes. And then you have all sorts of problems sending kids outside at all for safety issues during the winter. So it's a real problem. And so way before I came into this, the goal was to try to fix this problem, right? One by one. And so the after looks something like this, but it looks different for every school. So Reflow, I love Reflow. They are an amazing organization. They go in and do this process up here at the top of first conceptual planning, right? So they pick the schools based on their need and their enthusiasm. Those are the two criteria. And then they have this cohort of schools, and they spend a year doing planning. So they'll draw blueprints, they'll talk to the green team, they'll talk to all the parents and the teachers and everybody, and figure out what does this schoolyard need. Like some schoolyards need, a soccer field. Others need an outdoor classroom. Others need a community garden space. Depends on the school, right? What do they need? What will they most use? And then they spend a whole year fundraising, because these are expensive, right? It's expensive to do this. And then year 3 and onward, they do construction, and then there's maintenance. And one of the mandates for this is that if you're going to be in this program, you have to have a green team, and the green team has to be active, right? So because you need somebody to take ownership over that space and continue to manage it. So what we've done is, because they do this year after year after year, we've built our study around that sort of organization. And so we started with our pilot year in 2022 with these schools. And then we've done a couple of other cohorts as well. Every spring, we go in to collect pre-data. In the summer, the moment the schools close, they start construction. And then we go back the following spring to do post-data collection. The reason we wait a whole year to do this, well, there are multiple reasons. One, if we don't do that, we'll have all sorts of seasonality problems in trying to make any claims about spring versus fall. It's just not going to work. Number 2, things that you plant need time to grow, right? Things that you change need time to establish. So in the fall, sometimes it's fenced off, or there's not a lot that you can do with those spaces. So they wouldn't really have exposure to them yet. Yeah, so those are the 2 main reasons. And then we do it only one pre and post, because essentially these are elementary school kids, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and they graduate and they move on, right? So we have to do just one pre and post in order to get them before they move on to their next school. So that's sort of the structure of our grant. The pilot year was not funded by an extramural grant, and then the other 3 years are EPA. Just to go back to this, the central ideas of the project are that social emotional health, air pollution, heat exposure, physical activity, and education outcomes, we've seen that in the literature, could all improve with greening. And that differences in outcomes might be observed by sex or gender. We know from the literature that girls and boys play differently in different types of spaces. And that the student use of the schoolyard will vary based on the green space level and the intent of schoolyard features. So we really are digging in to say, okay, how are the different types of features on the schoolyard used? So I'm not going to go into big details here, but these are all the measures we're collecting. There's a lot of data being collected. We're doing surveys with the students, pre and post, in both English and Spanish, and we do have consent forms in a range of languages for the parents, because there's a very diverse community, including refugee community in Milwaukee. We're doing now, recently, a teacher survey it's called the Brief Problem Monitor, and it's a behavioral tool, essentially. Are these children providing challenges in the classroom, or are they getting distracted? Are they, is there any conflict, that kind of thing. We are asking the kids to wear sensors, so they put on a belt, and they wear a GPS device and an accelerometer. and so we can see where they're playing on the schoolyard, how much time they're spending, how active they are in different places on the schoolyard. We're doing direct observation, so we go in with a checklist and observe recess, so looking for things like teacher involvement, student conflict, what kinds of ways are the kids playing or engaging with each other. We're also going in and using MPS and reflow records. So MPS collects a lot of data, and some of the things we can look at are attendance, not necessarily grade point average, but performance, test scores, but we can also look at things like injury reports. I have a child who came home one day after playing American Ninja Warrior, and we thought he was just hurt, but no, he had a broken wrist, right? So we got an injury report. I'm sure people are familiar with this. He fell on concrete, right? If he had fallen on green space, we would have been fine. Student demographics, student body characteristics, all of this types of information. We're also doing secondary databases. I'm trained as a geographer. I do a lot of work on GIS. We're pulling in things like aerial imagery and census data and various other ways of looking at the neighborhoods and the spaces around the schools. We're also now pulling in photography. We just did this work this year. So we're taking pictures of the view that the kids have from the classroom out the window. And if the window is closed and has posters on it, we take a picture of that. We don't open the window. Thermal and aerial imagery is something we want to pull in. And then this last time we also did recess ratings, just using like a happy to sad face thing and having the kids punch in how they're feeling before and after recess. I also want to highlight a change in our methodology around surface temperature and some other things, which came from a collaboration with Dr. Lataro and his Terra Rover device. So that is a much easier way of collecting heat data than what we were doing before. These are just some images of some of the things that I just described: accelerometer, GPS, the surveys. This is the air beam. It's an air quality monitor for PM 2.5. Kestrel monitor, and then that is a medical student collecting the recess framework. And then this is the Terra Rover, which is pretty fun. This is Yu Hongzhou. She's our research scientist, and I think you know this guy. This is a training. This is us admiring, and that's trying it out. And she was really leading our environmental data collection, so took control of it from there. All right, so just some basic findings so far from this project. Basic demographics of our students. Again, 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, so you can see the age breakdown there. Primarily girls and boys, although we do have others indicating other genders. Race and ethnicity, you can see there as well. We did separate that into race and then into ethnicity. So you see 89 kids, 49% are saying other race. Primarily that is kids who identify as Hispanic, but it's also some others. And then preferred language, for the most part English, that they're answering the questions in, but some of them are Spanish. So right now, 359 in cohorts 4 and 5. We did just collect cohort 6 data, so our number is bigger than that now. Baseline social emotional health that we found in this population. So these, we primarily used the PROMIS measures from the NIH. And so essentially we're looking at 50 as everything should be. It's sort of the value that we would expect. And then anything higher or lower than that is significantly different than normal populations, so to speak. The perceived stress scale is a little bit different. It's not a PROMIS measure. But you can see there that 11.42 and 10.98, pretty close to the reference population, what we would expect from kids, so not a lot going on there. Positive affect, not a lot going on there, pretty close to the expected. But then we have some here that are red and significant, and so these are the ones that we're paying most attention to. Psychological stress, much higher in our cohort than what we would expect. Peer relationships, so the health of peer relationships is lower than what we would hope for. Cognitive function, also lower than what we would hope for. And anger, higher than what we would hope for. So these are some of the social emotional measures that we're taking a look at. And I have an MD PhD student, Shauna, who's right now on maternity leave with her little one, her second little one. She's really interested in disparities among kids in social emotional health, and so she did an analysis of our baseline data, and is basically finding a few places where we show some concern. So for anyone who identified their gender as another, so not boy or girl, we're seeing higher stress and lower positive affect, significantly different, and that's even though there are very few of those kids who are answering the question that way. Also, gender prefer not to answer, higher psychological stress. And then in terms of race, among American Indian and Alaska Natives, we're seeing higher stress and lower positive affect and higher anger. Among our Asian kids, lower positive affect and lower peer relationships. And then Hispanic, Latino, anybody who said yes to that, we're showing lower ratings on peer relationships. The only one of these I think that was positive is Hispanic, Latino. If they said another, they have decreased stress, but that's not as much of a meaningful group to hang your hat on there. So some concerns here for particular populations of kids, particularly racial and gender disparities. Shauna has also started to take a look at the actual schoolyards themselves and relate some of the schoolyard features to the measures that we're looking at. So this is an example of one of the schoolyards with some of the items, the features labeled there on the right-hand side. And so we've taken the data from the GPS and accelerometers and gone in and started to look at some differences. So this is the surface that she created, and these are just zones created based on the features and how they're defined on the schoolyard. So we're seeing quite a range of activity there in terms of, activity levels. 0 would be sedentary and 3 would be vigorous physical activity. So getting up to vigorous in some times on the schoolyard. Overall, the zones with the highest physical activity are the basketball courts, the traffic garden. Do you guys know what a traffic garden is? I don't know why it has the word garden in it, because it's not a garden at all. It's basically like, a pretend road and intersections and whatnot drawn on the pavement. So kids can ride their bikes around and then they stop at the intersection and then they take a left or whatever it is. So they've painted these on. The Bike Federation is working with the schools to put some of those in place. The grass field, right? We saw a lot of activity there. And then the turf soccer field. This is only one school. We're hoping to expand this to the other schools. Zones with the lowest physical activity were the benches. No surprise there. A painted mirror me game. And the entrance to the schoolyard. So it's making sense, which is good. But we're hoping to look at some of those other features to understand levels of physical activity and also time spent in those zones. And what are the places that are most impactful for the kids? That was the mean physical activity, so I just also wanted to show the range because there is quite a range. For example, in the traffic garden, you can see very little happening or a whole lot happening, right? So differences in these different places. And some of the zones did elicit moderate physical activity, which is good. We're looking to be able to measure some real exercise occurring there as well. Also comparing to the overall schoolyard, students were more active on basketball courts and in the traffic garden, so this is a statistical test here. And then zones intended for activities such as sports areas corresponded to higher physical activity. Areas intended for relaxation were lower. So physical activity isn't everything, right? We do want people to sit on benches and reflect. That's also part of this, right? And we're hoping to pick up some of that in our social emotional health work. We're also working on air pollution stuff. Right now it's a whole lot of data cleaning and processing, but these are just some initial maps of some of the walks that we did. And one school, Niskara, in the morning, in the midday, and in the afternoon. You can see that the levels of particulate matter change quite a bit across the day. That's part of why we're doing that. And higher in the afternoon, not really a surprise. It's mostly traffic-related pollution. There are anti-idling rules, but whether they're followed or not is left to be determined. So Yu Hong, who I mentioned before, and then Max Buchholz, who's a PhD student, are working right now on cleaning up this data, and we're hoping to be able to start sharing some information about the air pollution patterns soon. All right, so next steps for these projects, we're going to do the fall and the spring. curriculum, do our pre and post tests. Victoria's going to present at a conference, and we're planning for the MPS dialogue sessions. And for Grow, we have a whole lot of processing and data cleaning to do, which is thankless work really, but in the end, you get thanked. Shauna's going to present at APHA and to lead a paper. And then we have spring 2025 post data collection, which will be our last data collection. And then we'll be able to create our final analytical files and do our pre-post screening analyses. So just want to share some acknowledgements. I know we're coming up on the end here. A bunch of folks, including Dr. Nataro here at Madison, and a lot of other people. But special thanks to the EPA for the grant. And this is just some of our team. So thank you. Didn't leave much time for questions.
No, that was really great. Thank you very much, Kirsten. We will take a little time for questions, and there may be some online as well, but let's start. If there are any in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hi. I think it's very interesting the work that you guys did. And I just wanted to ask a question. Well, I did academic interviews in New York City with Council for Girls with like ages from like 18 to like up to 80 years old. We spoke to people. And one of the questions that we asked people when we did this was, what do they think about when they think about climate change? And some of the findings that we had was that a lot of people in New York City, and like I said, we spoke about different age groups and different ethnicities. We found among the circles we met about communities that we spoke to, a lot of people didn't relate to climate change as something that was like in their community, as something that was like happening in New York City. They related it to something like when we asked them like about the glaciers and about global warming. It wasn't something that was personal to them, or like something that was happening like close by. And so I would be like, I saw your curriculum, and one of the questions I gave you was, I know this is a elementary school that we were working with. Would you be willing to like do something with like high school students or like older different age groups? Because then hearing out one of the things that not only that we saw that it wasn't something that people saw that's happening also local. There's also this barrier, and another finding that we had was that a lot of people, especially in the BIPOC communities that we spoke to, they had barriers into like access to clean space, and because of different reasons, we found was because of family availability. As a child, they didn't have enough clean space in their community. So would you be also interested in like incorporating into your curriculum like things such as like a different intervention such as introduction to birding or introduction to like field trips? I know it has to vary and it has a lot of logistics around this, but it's just to think about like field trips, right? To being more exposed and then seeing what how that offers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't restate the whole question, but I think the question is really around, it's primarily BIPOC communities and the ability to see climate change as something personal rather than just something that happens far away where there are glaciers and whatnot. And incorporating more hands-on learning, exposures and field trips, that kind of thing. So I didn't present any of this work, but we are doing a lot of other work on environmental education, nature-based education, in partnership with some local organizations, the Urban Ecology Center, 16th Street Community Health Centers, et cetera. And that has been really important, I think. And I would say that for the children, and this is again anybody in K through 12, those pieces are getting integrated into the lesson plan ideas as something that can be very useful to help people to put their arms around this really and feel it, feel climate change as a personal thing. There are also programs that are trying to bring environmental education into the schools and into the different communities. The Urban Ecology Center and 16th Street are really awesome at doing this, and their missions are really about bringing all communities in contact with the nature and to do it in urban settings as well. So yeah, I mean, they're certainly open to that and interested in it. And yeah, our project right now for this one is focused on the younger kids, but I think the high schoolers, that would be fascinating to see some of the things they're doing and even look at green careers and some of the ways they may be taking their careers going forward.
one of the things that we're partnering with the Reflow is that we're implementing Diplo Youth Citizen Science Program. So through that, it's encouraging hands-on citizen science locally relevant, which tends to appeal to people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds and becomes community focused.
Yeah, for sure. Reflow does a lot in that zone as well.
I have to go get into
No
the
worries,
sorry.
no worries, no worries.
Yeah, I'm very excited about all the works that you've done, and then I have one quick question about working with children, because I've done some survey to kids about their thermal comfort feeling, and then because I set the kind of age range from 7 to 12 to make sure they understand those questions. However, sometimes they come with their siblings, their younger sisters and brothers together. So, for example, when you ask them like, "Are you a boy or a girl?" and then they just say, "I'm a Spider-Man." So, yeah, I know. So, in terms of the surveys or communicate with them, like, because you talk about some kind of social, like peer pressure or like those kind of feeling they have. Like, is there any strategies that you use to make sure they understand this question, and then how do you communicate with them?
Yeah, I'm a Spider-Man too. No, I think that's a really good question. I think not having other people around is critical, right? Not having people around who aren't involved. So in situations where we're trying to isolate a participant from other people who have childcare or something available to take care of that. In this particular project, when we go into the schools, we have multiple people. There's a lot of bodies involved in this work, right? So in corralling and managing a classroom and answering the questions and talking through with the kids. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we start at 3rd grade because below that, MPS doesn't even allow, you to be doing surveys. And we're very careful, making sure our tools are age appropriate and all of that, and that people are getting the hands-on, support that they need in order to answer the questions. But it's questions are sometimes read aloud, overcome literacy issues, and then everybody answers independently, but there are extra bodies to help corral and help. It's a good question. Kids are very funny. There's all sorts of things. I can tell you about how GPS devices got thrown in the toilet, and yeah. It's an adventure.
There is a question online about the data collection. For Roe, are you using matched pairs from pre-post with the students?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we are looking at each student pre and post, and then we're also just collecting anybody who's able to join pre and anybody who's able to join post. So we may look at some aggregate measures of folks, but yeah, we do have pre-post in the same individual, so it's the same students over time.
Okay, we are getting near the end. If there's maybe one more question, we can take it, otherwise. Okay.
Because,
Last word.
in the beginning, when you get together and plan for each school, how much of the spatial analysis of red zones and air quality, and how much of that goes into decision-making for what actually happens at a school?
Yeah, so that would be a question for Reflow, but I know some about their process. Reflow is savvy with GIS. They know all about these different, the places where the combined sewer has caused issues, all of these layers that you might consider. But then each of the schools that's interested in this has to submit an application. They come in, there's a presentation that they give. The principal definitely needs to be there to show buy-in. So it's about need, like if they can show pictures of ice and pipes sticking out of the ground and cracked asphalt and all of this, that's helpful. But if the principal isn't there, right, or if the green team has 2 people, no, right? There has to be enthusiasm because they want to have impact, and that requires both need and somebody to actually carry it out and enthusiastically take it to the finish line. So those are both aspects of it. But yeah, I think unfortunately most of the MPS schools are historically underfunded and historically marginalized, so it's really what is the worst of the worst in this case. But the need part definitely comes to the fore. Yeah.
Great, okay, thanks for everybody. Let's thank Kirsten again.